Good day, and welcome to this lecture, which addresses the subject of the American Revolution, alleged, and the question, why did many Americans begin to redefine their relationship to Britain during the period 1763 to 1776? It might be said that Americans began to redefine their relationship to Britain because Britain sought to redefine its relationship with its empire, particularly North America. Here we will observe the careful, if opportunistic, progress of the Founding Fathers in shaping the public mindset from a predominantly loyalist outlook to at least a sufficient proliferation of anti-British sentiment to engage in war. The various documents sent to you provide a framework for examining that process. Now, some definitions. Firstly, theories of revolution. Professor J.G.A. Pocock stated, "The term revolution may soon cease to be current, emptied of all meaning by constant overuse." Pocock offers this caution to historians and political theorists and blames them for debasing the currency of language regarding the study of socio-political change. He maintains the term has suffered from constant overuse since 1789 and is in danger of becoming meaningless. In historiography, it has been used to describe almost all types of circumstantial change, from the slow adaptation of industrial machinery and methods over a period of 50 years or more, to a few days of bloody street fighting, during which city architecture was redesigned and people were killed. Therefore, what does the term revolution mean, and when is its use justified? He believes that scholars have erected a straw man in their attempt to find theoretical explanations to the more spectacular instances of social upheaval. He considers that the time has come to reassess both the methodology and the language we use in our explanations of the process of social change or historical change. Perhaps the more recent events in Russia and Eastern Europe have made us extra cautious in our use of the term revolution. So back to our focus. So is it a revolution? The term means a complete overturning of government. You may wish to consider the French and Russian revolutions. In each case, this involved a comprehensive toppling of the existing government and replacement with a fresh outlook, for better or for worse. The coup d'etat. Some have suggested that it had more in common with the coup d'etat, albeit with an extensive war in between. The king was replaced by a president, who at the time possessed similar powers to George III. Parliament was replaced by Congress, with an elected upper as well as lower house. Yes, a major shift was to a written constitution. However, overall, this was largely a tinkering with an existing system. Civil war. For many, this was to be a civil war between loyalists and rebels. Although the dichotomy was only for a few extremists and most of the population had mixed views, yet clearly there were elements of civil war involved. Indeed, many British at home were supporters of the rebels. War of Independence. So it appears that War of Independence is the safe nomenclature, unless you were British at the time, and the favoured one among many modern historians. Indeed, it conveniently covers all the arguments mentioned without denying their validity. Nevertheless, there is one final observation on the causes of war, one which I find really interesting. Many of you may be familiar with Dr. Samuel Johnson's thoughts on the matter. There is much behind the myths, and in 1775 Johnson posed the question, how is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? So could that underpin the true nature of rebellion? The abolition of the slave trade was already an agenda item within British politics in this period. An intriguing idea and one worthy of further research. Now, one final and speedy definition: the concept of American. It is important to question the use of this term Americans, just as it would be to identify the members of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or to search for a definition of Indian in an India that did not truly exist before the British. It might be easy to slip into the idea that as an American nation, with all the usual attendant features of cultural and national identity, already existed. However, from research it becomes clear that there was simply a series of North American colonies, including those in Canada, united by a common tongue and legal ties to Britain, each with its own ruling classes of different types. For example, the oligarchic Penn family of Pennsylvania, or the church-dominated meetings of New England. They were not British administrative regions within a larger American society, but distinctive political communities sharing with England the heritage of the English Whig settlement. During the period in question, these colonists would have held their loyalties primarily as New Yorkers or Pennsylvanians. Secondly, they would be conscious of their national identity as Englishmen or Scotsmen, or whatever might be their origin. The concept of American was indefinite and took a considerable effort to establish it as a political and social force. A little bit of provenance here then. As Lawrence Henry Gibson wrote in 1935, it may be said as truly that the American Revolution was an aftermath of the Anglo-French conflict in the New World carried on between 1754 and 1763. By 1763, the British Army under Wolfe had achieved staggering success against the French. However, the cost to the national exchequer was high, and by the end of the war, Britain's national debt had risen to £113 million. Now, using current data from the reliable website Measuring Worth, this inflates by utilising the average earnings table to £239 trillion, a frightening amount in the 18th century. English landowners were incensed at having to contribute 15% of their revenue in taxes, especially in the knowledge that colonial merchants under Royal Navy protection had been involved in illicit trading with the French and Spanish in the West Indies. The money had to be recovered somehow, and it was felt justified in making the colonists pay for their own administration and a standing army of 7,500 troops. Prime Minister Grenville's first act was to prevent further costly Indian wars by forbidding westward emigration and reserving the prairies for the Indians. As might be expected from expansionist Americans, there was much resentment, and Grenville's policy was ignored. However, he did achieve some success in reorganising the system of customs and control of smuggling. Proclamation Acts. Grenville thought his acts reasonable, but any assertion of authority after so long an absence was bound to foster discontentment. Whilst preoccupied with this war in defence of North America, the British had been lax in the control of internal political affairs in the 13 colonies. Thus, by the Peace of Paris in 1763, an increased amount of independence had already been assumed in the colonies. So they were largely de facto independent. In addition to the Governor in Council, which mirrored the monarch and House of Lords, the assemblies, which were seen locally as the House of Commons, had developed unofficially. It was the existence of these matured political cultures that encouraged the colonists to resent Britain's assertion of its sovereignty. The debate essentially raged around the question of sovereignty. The British interpretation embodied by Grenville was quite simple. The King in Parliament was the sovereign body and took precedence over any local assemblies. Parliament at this time saw the colonies not as embryonic states but plantation bases and sources of materials and markets for manufactured goods. The documents in question show the machinations of the Founding Fathers and their opportunistic path to rebellion. The first of these of October 7th, 1763 emanates from the British government, not the colonial leaders, but provides the catalyst for action. I have two short video clips running one into the other concerning the Proclamation of October 7th. Most importantly, they provide information and clear cartography.
The British victory opened new territory for exploration and expansion, but it also brought the responsibility for overseeing three troublesome groups. The first were thousands of resentful former French subjects. French settlements remained in Canada, and even today, the French are a prominent minority in Quebec and Montreal. To keep the settlements under control, the British maintained a close watch, employed harsh tactics to quell rebellion, and deported large numbers of former French colonists. One group, the Acadians, left New France and settled in Louisiana, particularly around New Orleans. Over time, the name Acadian was condensed to the now familiar Cajun. France's Native American allies were Britain's second problem. With Britain's victory in the French and Indian War, the Indian supporters of the French were now in a precarious position. The French were no longer able to back their Indian allies, which left tribes like the Huron out of an increasingly British-dominated power and trade network. While the French developed trade connections with local tribes, the British were more inclined to remove indigenous peoples altogether and clear the land for white settlement. Some tribes feared that the influx of British colonists would result in their eventual removal from their lands. With the colonists marching forward onto his people's land, Chief Pontiac of the Algonquian-speaking Ottawa tribe led a bloody rebellion that resulted in the death of thousands of soldiers and settlers. The Ottawa besieged all but three of the British forts west of the Appalachians. The British countered by giving smallpox-infected blankets and handkerchiefs to the Indians. This disease swept through the Indian tribes and decimated their forces. The British regained the upper hand, but nonetheless realized the need to cohabitate peacefully with the Indians to prevent further turmoil. The third troublesome group was, ironically, the British colonists, who were beginning to test the boundaries of Britain's rule and were becoming increasingly aggressive toward the natives. In an attempt to maintain the situation until a peaceful resolution could be reached, London's government issued the Proclamation of 1763, which called for a halt to westward expansion beyond the Appalachians. The Britons hoped the proclamation would keep the colonists tied more closely to English colonial authorities by confining them to the coast. The British were in dire financial straits after the 7 Years' War, and they hoped that keeping colonists east of the Appalachians would facilitate the collection of taxes and allow England to refill its coffers.
And we do hereby strictly forbid, on pain of our displeasure, all our loving subjects from making any purchases or settlements whatever, or taking possession of any of the lands above reserved, without our especial leave and license for that purpose first obtained. The Proclamation of 1763.
However, the proclamation incensed the colonists, who felt they had earned the right to expansion by risking their lives to settle new land. They openly defied British rule and rushed westward, creating new settlements, facing new challenges, and becoming more self-reliant. The Proclamation of 1763 surfaced some resentments harbored by the colonists as a result of the French and Indian War. The colonists felt that the British were overly and unnecessarily formal during the fighting. They resented having to quarter British troops in their homes during the war, and they were angered by Britain's attempts to tax the colonists to pay for Britain's wartime support. To the British, the end of the French and Indian War was a costly victory, but one that opened up the North American continent to their total control and development. To the colonists, the British government was perceived as a nuisance whose demands for taxes became symbolic of an increasingly irrelevant colonial authority.
In the years following the conclusion of the French and Indian War, relations between Great Britain and its American colonies began to sour. In a matter of only 12 years, a series of disagreements would ultimately lead to rebellion and revolution. What were some of these disagreements? One of the earliest problems was a royal decree issued by King George III, known as the Proclamation of 1763. This order stated that colonists could not settle lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. This land would remain American Indian territory for the time being, the result of a backlash from a Native American uprising known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Once the Treaty of Paris had been signed, colonists began eyeing western lands that had been won from the French. Colonists were already encroaching upon the lands, and clashes between colonists and natives were becoming both frequent and alarming. Many Native American leaders, foreseeing the impending flood of settlers into their territory, began calling for American Indians to unite in defense of their lands. History has called the ensuing uprising Pontiac's Rebellion, named after one of the Ottawa chiefs who led the movement. Over a span of 1,000 miles, Native American attacks on the frontier were violent and furious. They attacked forts, destroying or capturing 7 of them, cabins, and hunters. British General Geoffrey Amherst and soldiers were sent to meet the threat at Fort Pitt and Fort Detroit. He and 500 men were ambushed by an unknown number of Shawnee and allied tribes at Bushy Run. Over 300 Shawnee were killed or wounded while the others scattered. The event gained London's attention, and the result was the Proclamation of 1763. Britain sent more troops to North America and began constructing additional forts. This came at a cost of £320,000 a year. The British Parliament felt that since the resources were going to the defense of the colonies, the American colonists should pay for it. But Americans viewed the scenario differently. Nearly every male colonist owned a gun, and from the age of 16 to 60, most served in the militia. In all, the colonists outnumbered the Native Americans living on the frontier 20 to 1. Colonists did not feel that the troops were needed. Prior to the French and Indian War, Britain had kept no standing army in the American colonies. Now that the war had been won, and the French had abandoned North America, more troops were being shipped in. Colonists also had all of the new land acquired from France, and King George III would not allow them to settle it, going so far as sending troops to forcibly remove settlers from the forbidden lands. Colonial agitation grew. Then, Parliament issued the Quartering Act of 1765. The Quartering Act of 1765 stated that colonists had to provide housing in barracks, public houses, inns, alehouses, or livery stables, food, and supplies for the British troops. Colonists had no say in the matter. Thomas Gage, the officer placed in charge of troops in North America, determined to station most of his soldiers in New York so that they could quickly be deployed to hot spots whenever needed. Initially, New York refused to accommodate the troops, but agreed to take them in after Parliament suspended their royal governor and the New York Assembly.
Now, just a quick word on the Stamp Act of 1765. The prevalent mode of thought supported the introduction of a series of tax laws. Most importantly, the Stamp Act of 1765, which has been defined as the beginning of the Revolution. This was not only a tax on trade, but also a direct tax on paper transactions, spreading duty from merchants to the professional classes. Again, Grenville did not consider this harsh. The rates were far lower than the British equivalent and the proceeds intended for use in America. However, the colonists objected, perceiving the act not as a tax, but as an assertion of British supremacy. The Whig faction in England, supporters of their American counterparts, and the unpopularity of the Stamp Act caused Grenville's downfall, and he was replaced by the more conciliatory Rockingham, who then repealed the Act, leaving him open to accusations of appeasement. Nevertheless, England still recognised that the threat to authority had to be met. When the challenge came, the Declaratory Act of 1767 appeared a cautious move, merely confirming Britain's right to tax the colonies, a right that already existed. Rather than send a message of strength, it more likely communicated an aura of insecurity, a want of real ideas, instead intensifying the problems and encouraging in the Americans a feeling that they had the upper hand. Objections to British measures were taken up by John Dickinson, a Philadelphia lawyer who also owned land in Delaware. In a series of Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, 1767 to 1768, Dickinson was one of the wealthiest men in the colonies. In our documents, the first letter drew attention to the Quartering Act, and the second letter considered the Townshend duties, which Dickinson thought was just as pernicious as the Stamp Act. Note the tone here. It remains conciliatory and wisely loyal to the king, as of course treason was punishable by death. While Dickinson accepted that Parliament could pass laws to regulate colonial trade, he insisted that it could not raise revenue in the colonies and made no distinction between external and internal taxes. Let us look now at this next clip, a lesson from the Penman of the Revolution. Small things grow great by accord.
Almost a decade before the Declaration of Independence, John Dickinson, often referred to as the Penman of the Revolution, gave some timeless strategic advice on how to approach government overreach. Starting in 1767, in response to the Townshend Acts, John Dickinson wrote a series of 12 essays known as Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. In his first, he spent time discussing the last of the acts, the New York Restraining Act, which was punishment for the Assembly of New York, suspending its legislative powers for failing to fully comply with orders from the Crown. Dickinson wrote, "If the Parliament may lawfully deprive New York of any of her rights, it may deprive any or all the other colonies of their rights, and nothing can possibly so much encourage such attempts as a mutual inattention to the interests of each other. To divide and thus to destroy is the first political maxim in attacking those who are powerful by their union." He continued to say that, in essence, the rightful response at that moment would have been for other assemblies to have passed a non-binding resolution informing Parliament that the act was a violation of rights and that it should be repealed. Why? Well, his answer came through clearly in his signature, where he wrote the Latin phrase Concordia res parve crescunt. It means small things grow great by concord. Clearly, the Penman of the Revolution was right, and small things did grow great in the coming years. In many ways, today's federal government has suspended the legislative power of state governments by assuming control over powers never delegated to the federal government by the Constitution.
Obviously, Dickinson was not alone in describing George III as an excellent prince. The colonists were devoted to the monarchy. There was very little overt republicanism in the colonies before 1776. It was not until it dawned on them that the king was inextricably attached to the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty that they were to become disillusioned. Then they were to react bitterly against him. The years of open confrontations, which began with the colonial response to the Stamp Act, culminated in 1770 with the so-called Boston Massacre. Depictions, reports and propaganda about the event heightened tensions throughout the 13 colonies, notably coloured engraving produced by Paul Revere. The first clip focuses on the events of March the 5th, 1770, through the engraving. The second clip focuses on the document itself and its provenance, so Paul Revere's print of the Boston Massacre.
Everything most Americans know about the Boston Massacre comes from this engraving. The patriot Paul Revere created it 5 years before his legendary midnight ride. The widely circulated picture shows a small group of unarmed civilians being cut down by a volley of musket fire. The picture has been reprinted in countless history books and pamphlets and has been the defining image of the incident for more than 2 centuries. But almost everything about it is wrong. The shootings took place at night, not during the day. A thick layer of snow and ice lay on the ground, and the colonists were not the passive victims depicted in the engraving. There were a total of 9 British soldiers that night, not 8. And most importantly, the picture has Captain Preston standing behind his men. Revere has shown his anti-British bias.
The witnesses, first of all, placed Preston in front of the soldiers to begin with. The soldiers are lined up very neatly, as if they're firing in formation and as if they're being given a signal to fire by the commanding officer. This contradicts the witness testimony. This makes it look like a massacre.
We have very little information about the victims of this so-called massacre. But one person depicted in the engraving has achieved a measure of fame: Crispus Attucks.
Crispus Attucks is probably the most well-remembered name from the Boston Massacre. He was popularly touted as the first Black American to die for the cause of freedom.
Attucks is remembered in history as the first victim to fall to the British guns, shot at point-blank range as he stood in front of the crowd. But is this really what happened? We actually know very little about Crispus Attucks. Was he a hero or a propaganda invention?
The real importance here is for the propaganda benefits and the gradual shifting of minds towards independence. The insertion of Crispus Attucks, an American stevedore of African and Native American descent, may have been to extend the appeal of anti-British sentiment. Note also that John Adams defended the British soldiers as he and the other leaders were not yet ready to show any disloyalty to the crown. They were content to let the poster and events do the work for them. The second clip may be of more use to you as historians, because it is always crucial to evaluate the document itself separate from the historical events contained therein, and that's exactly what this second clip does.
Here in Boston, structures, monuments, and markers permeate the city as reminders to its important role in the Revolutionary War. 5 victims of the Boston Massacre rest here at the Granary Burying Ground, only steps away from where they were shot. Near them lies Paul Revere, whose famous depiction of the incident fanned the flames of anti-British sentiment. Appraiser Wes Cowan joined me at the Old State House to discuss some lesser-known details of this revolutionary print. Wes, here we are at the Old State House in Boston, and it was right here where the Boston Massacre happened nearly 250 years ago.
That's right, Mark. This was a pivotal moment in the history of the American Revolution. It's March 5th, 1770. Dusk is falling. There was a British soldier named Hugh White standing on the steps to the custom house guarding the entryway. A Bostonian walks by, hurls an insult at this British soldier. Words are exchanged. Hugh White ultimately bludgeons one of the citizens with his rifle. A mob forms. Snowballs are thrown. Ice is being thrown. And eventually, all hell breaks loose.
And shots were fired.
That's right. 5 Americans were killed. 6 were wounded.
That's what we've come to know as the Boston Massacre. And that event inspires this Paul Revere print entitled The Bloody Massacre.
Well, I wouldn't exactly call it Paul Revere's print.
Why wouldn't you call it Paul Revere's print?
Well, Revere copied this print from a fellow artist and engraver here in Boston named Henry Pelham. He made the drawing, showed it to Revere, and Revere then copied it before Pelham had time to bring it to press.
So you're saying Revere plagiarized this?
Well, that's pretty strong, but I'll guarantee you that's what Pelham would have said. Pelham was furious, and he actually wrote Revere a letter. We don't know that Revere ever got the letter, but the letter basically said, this is the most dishonorable thing that I can imagine somebody doing. You stole my advantage. I'd already paid for all the paper and engraving, and he basically called him a highway robber.
So do you think Revere did this to get the edge on Pelham?
One could argue that, but it's also important to remember that Revere was a patriot, and he was staunchly against British rule. It's a piece of propaganda. The print shows British soldiers firing indiscriminately into this crowd, and that's not exactly what happened. But Revere recognized that this would be a galvanizing image. He knew it was going to incite sentiments on the American side, but he also may have wanted to get the jump on Pelham because he knew he could maybe make a buck.
And did Pelham ever release a copy of his print?
He did, 2 weeks after Revere issued his. He titled his The Fruits of Arbitrary Power or The Bloody Massacre. And when you look at the two prints, you'll see that there's subtle differences, but they're very, very similar.
Well, how many did Pelham make?
Well, we don't know that. We do know one thing, that only 2 have survived.
And Paul Revere's print of the Boston Massacre, how many of those were made?
Well, about 200. And there are at least 25 known copies still existing.
When original copies of Revere's print come to market, what have they gone for?
One recently sold for just about $150,000, but that's not the record. About 10 years ago, one sold for more than $200,000. So $150,000 to north of $200,000.
Yeah.
The Pelham print is really rare, but it's probably not as desirable as Revere's print. If one were to come up at auction, I would expect it to have an estimate of at least $50,000 to $70,000. And this is a great example of one of those things where rarity does not necessarily equate with value.
Well, Wes, thanks so much for sharing all this information. Just fascinating.
That was great to see this print.
Yeah.
There appears to be more blood on the Revere version. From here, actions began to escalate, and one important event, the Boston Tea Party of 1773, ended British attempts at conciliation. American reaction was unacceptable. At first claiming they were against direct taxation, but for indirect taxes on trade. When Britain tried this, the Americans insisted on regulatory and not revenue taxes. Finally, they cried, no taxation without representation. However, on the question of parliamentary sovereignty, the government had the backing of all parties. There were no friends of America. They stressed the point that many elements in Britain, such as Birmingham or the urban poor, remained disenfranchised. The House of Commons was competent to make decisions for its entire people, distance being no barrier. It's important to remember that many elements in Britain, such as Birmingham or the urban poor, remained disenfranchised. That the British concept of democracy represented interests. For instance, the perception was that a woman's representation is through her husband, and not a denial of rights. The ethos of one person, one vote is much more American in origin. In truth, Americans at all levels have found a political maturity never fully comprehended by the British, and have begun with constant testing of the mother country to see their relationship as one of equals. Under the coercive acts of Lord North's government, enough goodwill was still evident and rebellion unlikely. However, the closing of Boston's port and suspension of the Massachusetts Charter resulted in the calling of the First Continental Congress. War itself did not begin until the slaughter of 293 British soldiers returning to Boston in April 1775. The British government was still unwilling to take steps that would engender lasting hatred. The British fleet could have imposed a total blockade on American ports, but chose instead to weigh anchor in New York Harbor, expecting the rebellion to fade away. However, resolve stiffened, and Congress declared independence on July 4, 1776. It is debatable whether the Olive Branch Petition of the 8th of July 1775 was an appeal for a peaceful resolution or a test of the King's response. Therefore, why did the colonists appeal to the King? What does the petition reveal about their views of George III and his ministers?
When news of the Battle of Bunker Hill reached the Second Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia, they were placed in a difficult situation. The First Continental Congress had left Philadelphia in the fall of 1774, having made recommendations of continued boycotts in the face of the intolerable acts. Battles at Lexington and Concord had taken place a month before they were scheduled to meet that second time, and they believed that peace was still possible with England. The events of Bunker Hill, though, began to start some members thinking of independence, although they stayed silent, waiting for a majority of members to realize the inevitable. The majority of members of the Second Continental Congress still favored peace and sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George III and Parliament in early July 1775. This document was written primarily by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania and stated that the colonists merely wanted to be able to negotiate the trade and tariff laws that they had been imposed on the colonies and pay the same level of tax as those in England. The problem for the Congress was that King George III was not in a negotiating mood. He had already received word on the battles at Lexington and Concord and at Bunker Hill, and a letter from John Adams stating that war was inevitable and that the colonists should devote some time and money to raising an army. The king was not happy with all this news and never opened the Olive Branch Petition. Instead, he issued a proclamation ordering everyone in the British Empire to do all they could to suppress what he called rebellion in his North American colonies. Very few people to this point had thought of battles in Massachusetts as the start of a rebellion. Yet what King George III did in his proclamation was to divide the colonists between complete independence and submission to the king, and force many to choose independence.
So, the petition places the responsibility for the resort to arms squarely on the shoulders of the king's ministers, rather than the king himself. It declares in extravagant terms the loyalty of the colonists to George III, and those who supported the appeal still held out hopes that the monarch would act as an impartial judge between them and his wicked counsellors. The magnitude of the petition lies in the King's response, as read by John Hancock. The following clip is from a television drama called John Adams. Highly recommended as being historically accurate. Note the mixture of cautious and fearful looks, and the final conversation reveals Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams as jubilant motivators of rebellion, clearly summarizing what now needed to be done.
General Washington still awaits our reply to the problem of re-enlistments.
The king will see.
Now, he respectfully suggests that a salary be granted our soldiers commensurate with their sacrifice. But he has no money on hand to pay them. Tents, soap, shoes, and blankets are also greatly wanted. The Army recently took shipment of 50 crates of rifles, all without the flints required to shoot them.
The Proclamation by King George III. Many of our subjects, misled by a desperate conspiracy of dangerous and ill-designing men, have forgotten the allegiance which they owe to the power that has protected and supported them, and have declared rebellion and traitorously levied war against us. It is the better part of wisdom to put a speedy end to such disorders. We have thought fit to issue our royal proclamation that all our royal officers, both civil and military, are obliged to suppress such rebellion and bring the traitors to justice. When the unhappy and deluded multitude against whom this force shall be directed shall become sensible of their error, I shall be ready to receive the misled with tenderness and mercy. For those who persist in their treason, the punishment shall be death by hanging. Given in Parliament this 26th day of October in the year 1775. God save the King.
God damn the King.
God bless the King. Who else could have brought such a spirit of unity to this Congress? We will now all hang together, or most assuredly, we will all hang separately.
The question is no longer whether there shall be independence, but when.
If we force a decision too soon, we may reap disaster. Independence without unanimity means nothing.
I'm in complete agreement, Doctor.
I will leave immediately. The Virginia Convention must free us to act.
All 13 clocks must strike at the same second.
From this point, allegiance and loyalty to the king was quashed, and the way was clear for the most powerful publication of this era, Thomas Paine's Common Sense of 10th of January 1776. Now matters moved at a pace. What therefore was the common sense in Common Sense? How do we account for the popular appeal of Paine's pamphlet? So let's go straight to this first clip.
As the war entered its second year, many Americans still hoped to avoid a complete break with the British Empire. But even as news of the defeat in Canada reached Continental Congress in Philadelphia, support for an absolute break with Britain was growing. Where was this sentiment coming from? While the politicians bickered, people across the colonies were reading an argument for independence that was far more powerful than any yet made by an American. In January of 1776, Thomas Paine, an Englishman who had been in the American colonies for less than 2 years, assaulted the concept of peace with Britain, scoffing at the idea that King George III should be viewed as the symbolic father of the country. Of more worth is one honest man to society, and in the sight of God, than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived, Paine wrote. He went on to refer to the king as the royal brute of Great Britain, before hacking away at the idea that the mother country nurtured America and made her rich within the British Empire. Nothing could be more fallacious than that kind of argument, Paine declared. Paine stated that America suffered because of its connection to England due to the endless European wars that it had been dragged into. He also argued that the distance between America and England, along with their stark difference in size, were other arguments for independence. There is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island, he wrote. Paine insisted that a new era in politics is struck. and that all proposals for reconciliation made no sense since blood had been shed. Paine backed this argument with a claim that it was now America's mission to be a champion of liberty. In bold language, the 47-page pamphlet went on to call for complete independence from Britain, arguing that it was common sense to stop following the royal brute. He declared that the American struggle was not simply one over taxes, but a struggle for freedom. Paine argued that citizens, not kings and queens, should make their laws. The pamphlet caught the attention of Americans, changing the way many of them viewed the king. It made very strong arguments for creating economic freedom for America, as well as the colonists' right to military self-defense. Paine cried out against tyranny, and the public listened as 120,000 copies of Common Sense rolled off the presses in the first 3 months. This is equivalent to selling almost 20 million books in modern America. Common Sense went through 25 printings in 1776 alone, selling more than 500,000 copies in America and Europe. It was printed in multiple newspapers and read at town meetings throughout the colonies. Paine published the work anonymously and donated the royalties to George Washington's army, not only galvanizing the call to war, but helping to fund it as well.
Many of the statements in the John Adams clip were spoken not secretly, but certainly behind closed doors. But now it was all available for mass consumption. Much of the Common Sense is concerned with political theory, as Paine tried to demonstrate that government is no more than a necessary evil, while hereditary monarchy was absurd. In his attack on George III, however, he articulated ideas that many Americans were now thinking, but few dared to utter. Thus, he called him the royal brute of Britain, and the hardened, sullen, tempered Pharaoh of England. He thereby paved the way for the attack on the king in the Declaration of Independence. Its advocacy of independence as the only cause worth fighting for was seen by many Americans as common sense. The second clip provides a useful overview of the events leading up to Common Sense and a little about Paine himself. So, here we go.
Hi everybody, let's take a look at Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine. It was published in early 1776, and it's one of those key American documents that would inspire the colonies to fight for their independence. Now, before we dive into the author or even the document itself, let's take a look at some of the background that led to its publishing. And the first thing to keep in mind is that the colonies had been in revolt against England for about 9-10 months at this point. And the First Continental Congress had met in the summer of 1775, and that's where they had appointed George Washington as the general of the Continental Army. And the key thing to keep in mind is that there's still this really big debate in the colonies, and it is over, do we go for full independence against England, or do we go for improved representation within their political system at the time? And people are kind of split in arguing about this. And so enter Thomas Paine, who is going to change this conversation or this debate. And a quick little background on Thomas Paine himself. He was actually born in England, and he tried a variety of careers growing up, from the naval trade to teaching. And it wasn't until he met Ben Franklin one time, when Ben Franklin was visiting in London. And Franklin actually encouraged him to come to the colonies. And so Thomas Paine moved to the American colonies in 1774. And this is only about 2 years before the official revolution is about to start. And when he arrives when they're in the midst of this revolt. And he takes a job as an editor of the Pennsylvania magazine. And he's really inspired by how the British are treating the colonists. And he begins to form these really kind of harsh views of England itself. And so in early 1776, he's convinced he needs to write this. And he writes Common Sense. And when he publishes it, he actually hides his name from the publication. And his overall thesis in Common Sense is that the colonies needed independence, not improved representation from the British government. And also, this idea of a king as a leader, that's ridiculous. Rulers should be chosen by the people, and it shouldn't be hereditary. Common Sense is only 80 pages long, and it's actually kind of considered a pamphlet. And Thomas Paine broke it into 4 different sections. And the first section was called Origin and Design of Government. And here he makes the case that elections are the right thing for all governments because they represent the people. In the second section, it's titled Of Monarchy and Succession. And here's where he makes that argument that hereditary kings are not the way to go for governments. And he has probably one of his most famous lines of the whole document: of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. Essentially saying, one honest worker is worth more than all the kings who have ever lived in history. The third section is called Thoughts on Present State of American Affairs. And here's where he emphasizes independence. That is the key to America's future here, not partial representation. And in the fourth and final section, titled On the Present Ability of America, he emphasizes the colonies are more than capable on their own with all their natural resources and the growing population to sustain themselves as their own country. And finally, let's take a look at the impact of Common Sense. This pamphlet is a huge success and pushes the majority of colonists in favor of full-on independence. It was written in a style that was very easy for everyone to understand and published in newspapers throughout the colonies. It was very forward-thinking for the day. We take the idea of independence as the obvious choice back then, but it wasn't so simple. England was the biggest world power of the day. They had just won a major war against France that had solidified their power around the world, and independence would be no easy thing against them. Also, every country in the world at this time is in a monarchy of some type, when Thomas Paine is sitting here calling for independent elections. It was very brave thinking. However, its biggest impact, 5 months after it was published, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. And largely because of its popularity, they decided to write the Declaration of Independence, stating their desire once and for all to break away from England.
Finally, Common Sense provides the core inspiration for the unanimous Declaration of the 13 United States of America, July 4th, 1776. The British government was still unwilling to take steps that would engender lasting hatred. The British fleet could have imposed a total blockade on American ports, but chose instead to weigh anchor in New York Harbor, expecting the rebellion to fade away. However, resolve stiffened and Congress declared independence on July the 4th, 1776. A powerful movement had come to an end with the birth of the United States. The lessons learned from this enabled Britain's more skillful handling of its other settler colonies in granting them dominion status and eventually independence within the Commonwealth. So let's take a brief look at this weighty document.
The Declaration of Independence is the central document of American history. While previous declarations of American rights had listed life, liberty, and property as the 3 primary concerns, Jefferson opted for the much more meaningful phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This new approach was centered on a more optimistic view of America's future, and the spirit of the document was key to establishing the principles that would make the United States of America the country it is today. What else did the Declaration of Independence state? Adams' prediction that the 2nd day of July would be the Great Anniversary Festival of America proved false, as Congress chose to edit Jefferson's declaration before approving it. None of these changes were accomplished without serious debate, and once again, John Adams proved to be the bulldog of the Revolution by fighting fearlessly for every word of Jefferson's writing. 2 key omissions were criticisms of the English people themselves and a harsh indictment of King George III for imposing slavery on the American colonies. Jefferson agonized over the mutilations of his document, but the alterations made the Declaration more acceptable for the American colonies as a whole. The Declaration consists of 4 major sections. It contains a preamble or introduction to justify the adoption of the document. The second paragraph, known as the social contract, reads, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government." Part 3 of the document goes on to state a long list of grievances against King George III and Parliament. The crimes committed by the British government include cutting off our trade with all parts of the world and imposing taxes on us without our consent. The document also states that Americans had petitioned for redress in the most humble terms, but that the petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. The Declaration of Independence concludes by announcing America's independent status as a nation. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
So, finally, was this a revolution, or as some claim a war of independence between two states? Well, there is some evidence of the principle of desynchronization. The British failed to see how a century of indifferent government had created a reality, if not a legality, of independence, revealing them to be out of touch with the values and ideologies of the American colonists. The British saw all their colonies as a single constitutional state with the mother country, and could hardly see the actions of the colonists as anything but a revolution, certainly not a war of independence between equals. However, time and victory for the Americans has defined this as a war of independence. Thank you very much.